June 24th, 2024. Off the coast of Suffolk, the North Sea looked calm, but hidden beneath a tarpaulin on a rigid-hulled inflatable boat was a fortune in white powder. When border force cutters closed in, the smugglers panicked. One man gunned the throttle, trying to outrun the law. The other leapt into the waves, desperate to swim to freedom. Within moments, the chase turned chaotic. Engines roared, radios crackled, and officers surged forward, knowing this wasn't just another smuggling attempt. This was a shipment worth nearly £39 million. By the end of the day, both men would be in handcuffs, the drugs seized, and investigators piecing together how the operation had unfolded. They believed the smugglers had linked up with a larger vessel in French waters before attempting to sneak their deadly cargo across the channel. What they didn't count on was the speed and precision of Britain's maritime border forces and the relentless follow-up by the National Crime Agency. This documentary tells the full story, from the dramatic bust off the Suffolk coast to the courtrooms where two men were handed long sentences. A smuggling run that was meant to be smooth ended with panic, prison, and a £39 million loss. The Suffolk coastline has always carried a dual identity. For most, it's a peaceful stretch of seaside villages, fishing boats, and quiet horizons. But for organized crime groups, it's something else entirely. An entry point, a hidden gateway into Britain for tons of narcotics that never show up in tourist brochures or postcards. On the morning of June 24th, 2024, residents near East Benector Broads noticed nothing unusual. The sea was calm, the beaches largely empty, and holidaymakers strolled along the shore. What they didn't know was that just a few miles offshore, a rigid-hulled inflatable boat, RHIB, was cutting through the waves. On board were two men with everything to lose. The vessel wasn't just another fishing trip or pleasure ride. Concealed under tarpaulins and hidden compartments sat 350 kilograms of high-purity cocaine, packed tightly into bales. The load had been picked up in the English Channel after what investigators later said was a rendezvous with a larger vessel coming from continental Europe. To crime networks, this was standard practice, avoiding commercial ports where scanners, dogs, and customs officers posed too many risks. For Bruce Knowles, 56, a Norfolk man with a checkered history, and Ferhat Gümrükgöglü, 32, from the Netherlands, the plan was straightforward: land the boat, unload the shipment, and disappear. What they didn't know was that the National Crime Agency and Border Force were already watching, ready to strike. On the morning of 24th June 2024, the calm waters off the Suffolk coast became the stage for a dramatic pursuit. Border Force officers working alongside the National Crime Agency had been tracking a rigid-hulled inflatable boat as it made its way towards the shore. Intelligence suggested the craft had collected its load at sea after meeting a larger vessel in the channel. What looked like a small speedboat carried something far more valuable than fishing gear or supplies. When officers closed in near Lowestoft, the smugglers panicked. At the helm was Bruce Knowles, a 56-year-old from Durham. Alongside him sat Ferhat Gümrükgöglü, a 32-year-old Dutch national. Concealed beneath tarpaulins and stowed in the hull were tightly packed bales, almost 350 kilograms of high-purity cocaine destined for the UK market. Rather than give up, the men gambled everything on escape. Gümrükgöglü leapt first, diving into the cold sea and striking out for the shoreline. Knowles pushed the throttle hard, the inflatable skimming across the surface in a futile attempt to outrun the Border Force cutter. With the officers closing in, he abandoned the controls and jumped overboard himself. The unmanned boat careered towards land before running aground on a Suffolk beach. On the water and along the coastline, police and Coast Guard units coordinated the chase. Knowles was arrested soon after in the surf, while Gümrükgöglü managed to get further inland before officers tracked him down later that day in Wrentham. Their bid for freedom had lasted minutes. The drugs, the boat, and the suspects were all in custody, and the operation that had promised them millions was already falling apart. With both men in custody, attention turned to the vessel that had carried them across the channel. The rigid-hulled inflatable boat, now beached along the Suffolk coastline, was hauled to safety and examined under guard. What investigators uncovered confirmed just how significant the operation had been. Beneath tarpaulins and hidden in makeshift storage compartments lay 350 kilograms of cocaine, tightly packed into bales. Each brick bore markings, a crude branding system used by cartels and traffickers to track their shipments through the chain of supply. For the National Crime Agency officers, it was clear this was no amateur run. The drugs were of high purity, shipped in bulk, and destined to be cut and distributed across the UK. Experts estimated the seizure carried a potential street value of £39 million. Had the consignment made it through undetected, the haul would have flooded communities with thousands of individual street deals, fueling addiction and crime far from the Suffolk beaches where it was intercepted. The cocaine was catalogued, bagged, and transported under armed guard for forensic testing. Every package was weighed, photographed, and recorded as evidence. It wasn't just about securing convictions against Knowles and Gumruk Gwoglu. It was about understanding the wider network that had placed such trust in two men and a small RHIB to deliver millions of pounds worth of narcotics. The recovery was a major victory for law enforcement. Border Force officers had executed a dangerous interception at sea, while the NCA now had tangible proof of the smuggling run. And with the drugs safely seized, the investigation could begin to look outward, probing where the shipment came from and who else might have been involved. And once the cocaine was secured, the investigation shifted to understanding how this run had been organized. The seizure was not just about two men caught on a boat. It was about a supply chain stretching across borders with layers of planning behind it. National Crime Agency officers began piecing together the route. Intelligence suggested the rigid-hulled inflatable boat had made contact with a larger vessel in French waters before setting course for the Suffolk coast. This method was a well-established tactic. Transfer the drugs at sea, then rely on a smaller, faster boat to slip into the UK largely unnoticed. But this time, surveillance teams were already watching. The NCA worked with Border Force to reconstruct the men's movements. Maritime tracking data, GPS logs, and phone records painted a clearer picture of how Knowles and Gumruk Gwoglu came to be on that vessel with such a massive haul. The pair had little in common on the surface, one a British national from Norfolk, the other a Dutch citizen. But both were clearly trusted enough to handle a consignment worth tens of millions. Investigators also drew on forensic evidence. Fingerprints and DNA found on the packaging linked the men to the cargo. For prosecutors, this meant the case didn't rely solely on eyewitness accounts or surveillance footage. It was backed by hard science. Meanwhile, officers sought to understand where the drugs were headed. While the final distribution network wasn't fully revealed in court, investigators believed the cocaine was intended for wholesale markets within the UK, where organized crime groups would break it down, adulterate it, and push it onto the streets. By August 2024, the evidence file was complete. The weight of the drugs, the circumstances of the interception, and the forensic links left little room for doubt. At Ipswich Crown Court, both men faced the charge of importing a Class A drug. With the evidence stacked against them, neither chose to fight it. By the time the case reached Ipswich Crown Court in August 2024, the facts were undeniable. The seizure of nearly 350 kilograms of cocaine, the arrests on the Suffolk coast, and the forensic evidence tying both men to the cargo made the prosecution's case overwhelming. Bruce Knowles, 56, and Ferhat Gumruk Gwoglu, 32, stood accused of importing a controlled Class A drug. Facing the weight of evidence, both men entered guilty pleas. There would be no long trial, no cross-examinations, and no chance of persuading a jury otherwise. Their attempted escape at sea, once an act of desperation, was now a damning symbol of guilt. During sentencing in May 2025, the court heard about the potential impact of the haul had it not been intercepted. Prosecutors highlighted the street value of £39 million, stressing that the drugs would have fueled addiction, crime, and violence across the UK. This was not a small-time operation, but a shipment designed to supply organized crime networks on a massive scale. The judge handed down lengthy custodial terms. Knowles, the older of the two, was sentenced to 17 years and 3 months in prison. Gumrukoglu, described as equally complicit, received 15 years. Both sentences reflected the seriousness of the crime, the high value of the cocaine, and the clear role each man had played in trying to bring it ashore. In court, neither man showed signs of defiance. The bravado they had displayed leaping into the sea was gone. Instead, they were led away in silence, the prospect of years behind bars replacing the millions they had once imagined. When the gavel finally came down at Ipswich Crown Court in May 2025, it brought closure to one of the most dramatic smuggling cases Britain had seen in years. The courtroom sentences, 17 years and 3 months for Bruce Knowles and 15 years for Ferhat Gumrukoglu, weren't just punishments for two men who had gambled and lost. They were statements that Britain's borders were being defended and that major criminal enterprises could be intercepted and dismantled. But the impact of this case went far beyond the walls of the court. For the National Crime Agency, the bust represented a textbook example of intelligence-led policing. Their maritime operations team had pieced together clues from multiple sources: suspicious vessel movements, intelligence on French supply routes, and coordination with European counterparts. When the RHIB, carrying 350 kilograms of cocaine, was spotted near the Suffolk coast, it was the result of weeks of preparation. NCA operations manager Paul Orchard later called it a fast-moving and dynamic interdiction, underlining the speed at which surveillance had been converted into action. The Border Force too saw the case as proof of what their officers could do when faced with high-risk smuggling attempts. Maritime Director Charlie Eastaugh praised the courage and professionalism shown during the interception. Officers had to act decisively against suspects who were willing to leap into open water rather than face capture. Securing the vessel, recovering the drugs, and preventing two men from escaping across land or sea required skill, coordination, and calm under pressure. The seizure itself was staggering. 350 kilograms of high-purity cocaine with a potential street value of £39 million was prevented from ever reaching the UK's drug markets. To put that into perspective, once adulterated and divided, it could have produced hundreds of thousands of individual street deals. Each of those sales would have generated profit for organized crime groups, fueled further violence, and caused immeasurable harm in communities already struggling with addiction. By removing such a volume at once, the NCA and Border Force had delivered a major blow to the supply chain. The case also highlighted a recurring theme in Britain's fight against organized crime: the adaptability of traffickers. Large ports like Felixstowe, Southampton, and Dover are heavily policed, with scanners, sniffer dogs, and constant checks on containers. To sidestep this, crime groups increasingly rely on smaller vessels. RHIBS, like the one used by Knowles and Gumrukoglu, are fast, agile, and can land on almost any stretch of coastline. But as this case proved, even these tactics aren't foolproof. With maritime patrols and international intelligence sharing, law enforcement can and does strike at sea. For local communities, the bust was a reminder that their quiet coastlines are not isolated from global crime. On the surface, Lowestoft and nearby Suffolk villages are places of fishing, tourism, and family holidays, but geography makes them vulnerable, close enough to continental Europe for smugglers to see opportunity. The sight of police vehicles, coastguards, and a drug-laden RHIB pulled from the surf shocked residents unused to such events. Beyond Suffolk, the case fed into the national conversation on drugs. The UK has some of the highest levels of cocaine use in Europe, with an estimated around 800,000 people using the drug annually. Prices remain high, demand is steady, and organized crime groups continue to battle for territory and control of supply. Each major shipment seized removes profit from those groups and slows the flow. But authorities acknowledge that interceptions alone won't solve the wider problem. Still, stopping £39 million worth of cocaine in one strike was a clear win. For for Knowles and Gumrukoglu, the story ended in long prison terms. The images of them diving overboard in panic, one flailing towards the shore, the other abandoning the controls of a £39 million cargo, became a symbol of desperation. Their dream of a payday vanished in the waves. What they left behind was not riches, but evidence, seized drugs, and a case study in how quickly fortune can turn when law enforcement is closing in. The legacy of the Suffolk bust lies in what it demonstrated: that traffickers are willing to take reckless risks, that Britain's coastlines remain vulnerable to exploitation, but also that cooperation between agencies can shut down even high-value consignments. For the NCA and Border Force, it was another battle won in a long war. For the two men at the center of it, it was the end of freedom, traded for years behind bars. The lesson, ultimately, is stark. The sea can carry opportunity or ruin, and for those who see it as a highway for drugs, it can turn in an instant from a route to riches into the scene of their downfall.